Today the scripture reading will be taken from Luke chapter 5. That's Luke chapter 5 from verses 12 to 13. Luke chapter 5 from verses 12 through 13. It reads, "While he was in one of the cities, there came a man full of leprosy. And when he saw Jesus, he fell on his face and begged. And Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him, saying, 'I will be clean.' And immediately the leprosy left him." Preach the word.
Good morning. It's really good to see everyone this morning. For the first time for maybe some of you since my recent situation with my health, thank you for your prayers. It's good to be back. I appreciate that very much. From the reading, you can tell that we're going to be in Luke chapter 5 this morning, and we're going to be talking about the story of the man with leprosy. Jesus cleansed this man from his leprosy, as we read just a moment ago. But the story before this, we might remember, is the story where Jesus taught on the Sea of Galilee, on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. And there he performed a miracle where the disciples caught a bunch of fish. Peter, realizing that Jesus had the power and authority to perform such a miracle, came and fell at his feet and asked Jesus to depart from him because he was a sinful man. He confessed his sin. Jesus, in turn, called Peter to follow him, saying to him and his companions, "You will now be fishers of men." That was on the shores of the Sea of Galilee, but now this story that we begin to see this morning takes place within the city. And so we see the movement of Jesus going from the outer parts of civilization there around the Sea of Galilee into the city, into the urban areas. And that's where we find this man coming to him. Luke says that the man was covered with leprosy. Some versions read he was full of leprosy. Others say he was filled with leprosy. But the idea is this man had an affliction that covered and filled his entire body. The term leprosy, actually, that's used in the Old Testament and the New Testament, really is kind of a catch-all type of term. This term can be used to describe many afflictions of the skin. And so it could be talking about something as simple as perhaps a spot on your skin, or maybe boils or sores of some type, even inflammation of the skin, white spots, pink spots, rash spots. And so there's a lot of things that this term could be describing, but remember, Luke is a doctor. And so when he says he was full of leprosy, we're intended to see that this man didn't have just some spot or some temporary affliction. He had that dreaded disease, the one that would keep you outside of fellowship, the one that would change your life drastically, and the one that could only be cured by God. That's what this man had. And so he is a man affected on his entire body. Leviticus 13 tells us what the process was for people with this type of condition. There's a lot of detail there, and you can read that at some point. But the idea is that you would have to go to the priest, or actually the priest would have to come to you outside of the city. That's key. And the priest would examine you. And so in a way, the priest was also something of a medical professional when it came to this. Upon inspecting you, the priest might determine that you would have to be isolated for 7 days. If the priest couldn't tell what you had exactly, they might isolate you for another 7 days. And then they would make the conclusion. They would either pronounce you have a non-infectious disease, Leviticus says. And in that case, you would be declared clean. Everything would be fine. You would return back to your normal life. However, if the skin condition was determined to be an infectious disease, then the priest would pronounce the thing you did not want to hear, and that is, you are unclean. Now, everything in your life changes. Everything that has been normal in your life changes. And the words of Leviticus 13, beginning in verse 45, will now apply to you. And here they are. Anyone with such a disease, a defiling disease, must wear torn clothes. They must let their hair be unkempt, that is, not combed, and just however you wake up in the morning, that's how your hair is to remain. You are to cover the lower part of your mouth and face and cry out anytime you came within close proximity of a person, unclean, unclean. As long as you have this disease, verse 46 tells us, you remain unclean. You must live alone. You must live outside of the camp. When you look at the words there in Leviticus 13, 45 through 46, some of these words jump out. Defiling disease. Hair unkempt, uncombed. Cover your face. Unclean. You must live alone. Outside the camp. By the time of Jesus, there were, at different points, small leper colonies where perhaps people with the same affliction would gather in small groups and try to form some sort of community in their isolation from the rest of the populace. They had to live outside of the city. In fact, we are told about a group of lepers like this later in Luke's Gospel, chapter 17, where Jesus cleanses 10 lepers at the same time. But here we're looking at just one man. Think about it like this. Lepers had no communal, really, abilities. They couldn't be with large groups of people. They couldn't worship with the rest of the nation. National feast days, those were out. Any social gathering where there was a decent amount of people, they could not partake in. Stop and think of the plight of this man. If you could, try to imagine being this person. Can you imagine life like this? Wearing the torn clothes, the hair, and all of these things that are mentioned here. Separated from your family. Separated from maybe just meaningful work, a productive life. Separated from everything that would have been normal before. What must it have felt like to be such an outcast? Aside from any physical pain, which the text doesn't really mention, but probably was there, what was the psychological pain like? The emotional pain, the spiritual pain, to be separated not only from your people, but to a degree from God, in the sense that you couldn't come to him and be a part of the larger community. As I mentioned before, leprosy was a lot of times a life sentence. Once you had it, that was it. Your life had changed. You were different now. No hope, really, of cure or remediation. Truly a hopeless situation. Unless God would cleanse you. Maybe as I'm thinking about this and you're thinking about this and trying to put ourselves into this man's place, it is a little bit difficult, right, for us to kind of step into his shoes. I mean, after all, we're not subject to this type of suffering and affliction. We're not used to this type of pain. We hug our friends and family without concern. We gather for worship. We sit with family and friends. We eat. We enjoy companionship. Nothing like this separates us from those who we love. We have meaningful work. We are preparing for ministry. We're doing ministry. All of these things, right? We meet for worship. The truth of the matter is, really, sometimes we take these things for granted. We do them without thinking until something stops us and perhaps pain makes us reevaluate and see things in a different light. Verse 12 tells us this man came along. which is interesting because this man had ventured into the city, that which was forbidden to him. We know that because he finds Jesus in the city. That's why that first statement is so important. That's where Jesus was now. And so the man chases after Jesus. The man not supposing to go into the city, right? He's supposed to stay on the outskirts, but he went in nonetheless, seeking Christ. This, of course, highlights his faith. This, of course, highlights his willingness to risk doing what the law says you couldn't do in order to encounter Christ. This man had faith because he knew the only one that can cure me is God himself. He knew Jesus to be God himself, the Son of God. And so, yes, he was willing to risk it. There he goes, in search of Jesus, in search of God, in search of a cure. And I love verse 12 as it continues. When he saw Jesus, he fell with his face to the ground. Somehow this man recognized what Jesus looked like. Maybe he'd seen him before. Maybe he'd heard him before. But when he saw him, that was enough. He ran over there and fell with his face to the ground. That's a favorite term for Luke. Notice how many times Luke refers to this. Peter, in fact, in the previous story, fell at the feet of Jesus as well when he recognized the authority of Jesus. This man recognized who Jesus was, and he acknowledges his authority and his power and his status as the Son of God when he falls on his face. So much had been taken from this man. He'd lost so much being a leper. But the one thing he had not lost was his faith in God. What's interesting about this statement also is he does this before the miracle. Many times this is the reaction after Jesus does a miracle, but he does this before the miracle. And so his faith is highlighted even more. He knew he wasn't just in the presence of a great teacher or some impressive miracle worker only. He knew he was in the presence of God. And his next statement reflects that too, because he says, Lord, Lord, if you are willing, make me clean. The man knows Jesus can make him clean, but the question he leaves open is, are you willing to make me clean? The man not only acknowledges the power and authority of Jesus, but he acknowledges the fact that the wonderful grace of God works according to the will of God, not according to his own will, human will. And so he asks, he begs. The word begs here is an ongoing entreaty, a continuous plea for mercy and for grace. And that's what he asks Jesus for. The most beautiful verse, though, is 13, isn't it? When Jesus reaches out his hand and touched him. I am willing, he said. Be clean. And immediately the leprosy left him. The word used here for left is an interesting word because it really means to depart. It means to flee, to leave in a powerful way. Peter's mother-in-law had a fever and it left. It took off. The man possessed by an evil spirit, once he was cleansed, the spirit departed, left in a powerful way. It's not simply that something went away, it's that power drove it away. And that's what we have here. The leprosy left him. But let's back up. How beautiful the words of Jesus here, right? And if we notice, the response of Christ goes even beyond what the man had asked for. The man had asked to be cleansed, but Jesus gave him something more. Jesus gave him a greater gift because he reached out his hand and touched him. How long had it been since this man had been touched? The law stated that if anyone touched a leper, then they too were now unclean and could possibly have the same condition. And so Jesus grants him something he hadn't had in a long time, the simple touch of another human being. Compassion plus mercy plus grace plus power plus fill in the blank. The action shows Jesus' willingness to cleanse him, but also his compassion over his suffering. We need to remember that when we face those moments of suffering and difficulty and pain, the Lord seeks to reach out and touch us and grant us mercy and grace and love, the human touch. The man had longed to hear those words, hadn't he? You are cleaned. You are now clean. How those words had to have washed over his spirit. His life had been restored. Now everything had changed in completely the other direction. He was a whole person again. Now he could sit at the table again. Now he could worship God again. Now he could embrace his family again and be embraced by his family and friends. In short, he could now come home. He was whole. Restoration was now made complete. We're not told in the story, but perhaps this man had children. Now his children could come and be with him again. He could be with them again. Jesus tells them, you're not completely done, though. You need to go and offer the sacrifices commanded by Moses. So let's make sure we do this right according to the law, so that this will be a testimony to them, both of the power and authority of Christ, but also the status change of this man. A miracle had occurred. God had visited the life of this man in an, unconditional way. But what about us? We're not lepers. Again, it's hard for us to associate with him. What does this story bring for us? What does it mean for us? What are we to take away from this? Who are the lepers in our day? Who are the people who find themselves on the outside, perhaps? Those who've been marginalized, those who have been consigned to suffering for some condition or some reason or other. Who are those who might be isolated? Who are those who long for perhaps human recognition or human touch? Do we notice them? Are our eyes open to those who hurt around us? Or are we sometimes too busy? Are we sometimes just taking life for granted and moving along at our pace doing what we do? I think we all get busy, and it's easy sometimes to not notice others around us who perhaps are in need. But I think that's what this story calls us to do. This story calls us to open our eyes, to look around, to notice perhaps those who might need help that comes from God. They're all around, really, when we think about it. We just need to open our eyes and notice them. But once we notice them, perhaps we need to seek them in a more definite way. Extend our hand to them. Invite them to come home into the loving arms of Jesus. For we know that he's still willing, isn't he? He still wants to heal and to restore to life, spiritual life especially. This is our message today, isn't it? That Jesus is still willing to touch people in their place of pain, to bring wholeness to them, to bring restoration to them, to bring peace to them. That is our message, and it's our ministry. Like this man, there are some people who will find Jesus on their own. But there are countless others who might need some help. Others who need someone to lead them to Jesus. Need someone to bring Jesus into their lives. And so I leave us with just these last 3 quick points in relation to all of that we've talked about this morning. In our ministry and in our lives, let's make sure we're finding those who are hurting. Let's make sure that we bring them to Jesus, or bring Jesus to them, because he'll cleanse and restore and make them whole and change their lives once again. He's still willing to do that, and we're grateful. May God bless us.